Most of the countries of Europe declared sides and fought in the First World War, but by no means all of them. And remaining neutral, while it certainly kept down the numbers of the dead, had its own unique set of problems and difficulties. So today, we'll look at one of the neutral nations of Europe, the Netherlands. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War special episode about the Netherlands in the First World War. Neutrality was not something new to that nation. The Netherlands had practiced the politics of neutrality since 1839, when the Treaty of London had created an independent Belgium out of the southern part of the Netherlands. If you want to get technical, there had been an earlier treaty in 1831, but the Dutch had refused to sign it. Anyhow, like the rest of Europe, the Netherlands had gone through an industrial revolution, as well as a migration of large parts of the population from the countryside to the cities and towns. The Netherlands was in an interesting position, though, for it was a small nation with large overseas possessions, so it had a lot to lose from any European conflict. And so Dutch neutrality was political, independent, and armed. Political because, unlike, say, Swiss neutrality, it wasn't part of a constitution and was a policy that governments chose to follow. Independent because, unlike Belgian neutrality, it wasn't guaranteed by other nations. And armed because, since it wasn't guaranteed, it maintained an army. Its peculiar neutrality made it a center for peace conferences like those of 1899 and 1907, when Europe got together and agreed on just what was and was not acceptable during wartime, like no poison gas. We all know how that turned out. After Germany's unification in 1871, and for the next 2 generations, the Dutch well realized that a new conflict between France and Germany was more than possible. So they made no secret of the fact that they were pursuing armed neutrality, since an invasion through the Netherlands wasn't a bad plan of attack. Indeed, the German Schlieffen Plan to attack France initially did propose an invasion through both the Netherlands and Belgium to move troops faster and on a wider front. So the Dutch spent about a quarter of their annual budget on defense, modernized the New Holland waterline, and constructed Fortress Amsterdam, the last line of defense far from the borders. And Dutch politics in the years leading up to the war were all about maintaining neutral cred. Friendship with all, alliance with none was pretty much the motto. In fact, if you look at the Boer Wars, which were the British fighting against the descendants of Dutch settlers in South Africa, the Dutch government remained both neutral and aloof, even though there was widespread public sentiment for the Boers. Still, as July 1914 rolled on and the continent slid toward war, the Dutch mobilized an army of 200,000 men, and the railways were put under military orders. On August 2nd, 1914, German Army Chief of Staff Helmuth von Moltke declared that Germany would respect Dutch neutrality. But on the 4th, because of the German invasion of Belgium, the southern part of the Netherlands, below the River Waal, was placed in a state of war to protect the borders. If you're wondering how the Dutch army was organized, it was based on the German model. They had developed a mobile field army built on a divisional system, and most arms and armaments were imported from Germany and Austria-Hungary. The big difference between the Dutch and German armies, other than size, was that the Dutch army was strictly for defense and didn't really have much offensive capability. And this defense was in 2 parts, the mobile army for the border regions and the fortress defense for the heartland. Also, the Dutch had a shorter period of training, only 8.5 months. That last was actually a political concession opposed by the military. The mobilization went really smoothly under the direction of Dutch Army Chief of Staff C.J. Snijders. Germany did not invade any part of the Netherlands, and Britain too announced it would respect Dutch neutrality. But the invasion of Belgium caused serious chaos in the Netherlands. I mean, neutrality is always going to have problems with smuggling, spy rings, and border activity, but the immediate problem was that of refugees. By the end of October 1914, an estimated 1 million refugees had arrived in the Netherlands from Belgium and France, which produced an immediate humanitarian crisis. They were spread out and housed throughout the country, which was logical to avoid the spread of disease and prevent chaos at the borders. And though most did return home eventually, tens of thousands remained for the duration of the war. I gotta say that people were very good about welcoming the refugees into their homes. In Rotterdam, for example, there were far more locations offered than there were actual refugees. But many soldiers also fled to the Netherlands, and the Germans even built a 200-kilometer-long electrical fence at the Dutch-Belgian border to prevent crossing. 2,000 volts. This was called the Wire of Death, and within 500 meters of the fence, if you could not explain your presence, you were executed on the spot. Between 2,000 and 3,000 people were victims of the fence during the war. Let's look at the Dutch economy for a minute. Before the war, the Dutch economy was heavily dependent on foreign trade. They traded with both the British and the Germans, and though Dutch coffee, tea, and tobacco from the colonies was sent all over Europe, the Netherlands was poor in natural resources and imported fuel, raw materials, tools, and even basic foods from all over Europe. Under international law, they could legally trade with both sides during wartime, but Britain demanded that ships to Rotterdam not carry any goods bound for Germany, and the Dutch were now caught between giving in, which might cause war with Germany, or refusing, which might cause starvation if imports were stopped. So the Dutch trade minister created a grain bureau, a government monopoly that bought grain and guaranteed the British that it was only for domestic consumption. This might have worked, but the Dutch government refused to regulate the economy. A new trade minister, Volkert Postuma, was, however, pretty much forced to interfere in the economy. At first, this was to combat rising prices caused by rising costs of transporting things overseas to the Netherlands. But in 1916, and I'm leaving a lot out here, he divided agricultural exports equally between Germany and Britain to try to make everybody happy. But by this time, the problem was there were not enough ships getting in to supply the country. The war at sea had strangled imports, and once the Germans reintroduced unrestricted submarine warfare in early 1917, almost no Dutch ships would even leave port. In 1914, over 12,000 ships entered Dutch ports. By 1918, it was 1/7 of that. So food prices rose, and draconian government practices were enacted to conserve food. And in 1917, when potatoes were to be exported to Germany and Britain in exchange for coal and not given to the hungry Dutch, riots ensued. By 1918, the Netherlands faced famine for the first time in centuries. The darkest hour came in March 1918 when the Allies requisitioned all merchant ships in Dutch ports. Dutch Queen Wilhelmina called it a theft, and the threat of war grew as Germany demanded compensation. But at the 11th hour, the Allies withdrew their demands and allowed the Dutch to avoid war with Germany. And as the tide of the war soon turned in favor of the Allies, an agreement was made to limit Dutch-German trade in favor of the return of Allied imports. But new elections in September that toppled the liberals from power and scattered riots in the army brought the threat of revolution along the lines of that in Russia. However, the government responded effectively. Snijders was forced to resign, demobilization was promised, food rations were increased, and within days, the threat, though it hadn't been that serious, was over. And after the war? Well, it's not my job to tell you what happened after the war. Whether or not the ex-Kaiser of Germany would reside in Holland, how things would go economically. This was just a brief look at the incredibly complex situation of the Netherlands during the Great War, much of which I left out. Let's just say that the Dutch government had tried to build its policies on international law, but that was no match for might is right. And in reality, it was a shared interest in continuing Dutch neutrality by both the Central and Allied powers that kept that nation out of the war. The Netherlands was not the only country that stayed out of the war. Sweden was also neutral, and last summer we made a special episode about how that played out. If you want to see that, you can click right here. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.